Welcome to the Sisterhood of Limitless Living. I'm Dr. April Moreno, autoimmune wellness researcher and professional helping women around the world to live their best possible lives despite the autoimmune condition. Listen in as we speak on various topics about the autoimmune journey and interview amazing and inspiring women who are living and thriving despite their autoimmune condition. Let's get started.
Hello, Sisterhood. Welcome to another episode of the Sisterhood of Limitless Living podcast. The weather is cooling down. It's fantastic. I just went and sat outside and listened to the crickets, the chorus of crickets. It was beautiful. And I just wanted to share with you some updates here before we go into today's episode. I was just back from a women's podcast conference in Los Angeles, and I loved it so much. It's my first time going to this sort of thing. It's my first time meeting other podcasters even, and having the opportunity to hear some really great advice, to connect with even mentors who are doing great with their podcast as well, to learn more about both the business side and also the artistic side, the creative side is the way they described it, and being more having more of a strategic plan in place for things like that, for growth and audience. And there's so much that was discussed, and it was really a wonderful opportunity. But even more interesting, in my perspective, was the fact that even though the conference was about podcasting in general, I somehow started to stumble upon people living with autoimmune conditions, or people who are affected, living with family members, or grew up with people who had autoimmune conditions. So just hearing these stories was really encouraging in terms of wanting to share and continue working with the podcast. And really, I would encourage any of you out there, if you have thought about it, please consider podcasting. It has been a wonderful experience, and get your story out there. It could be about your autoimmune condition, about living with it, or it could be anything else, really. But getting more women out there, even getting people out there to understand and build awareness about our autoimmune conditions is really important. And so I am a big fan and a big supporter of podcasting. And so I just wanted to share that with you. It was really interesting because, when I was just standing in line and hanging out, I met people who were living with things like lupus, or with rheumatoid and other conditions. Multiple sclerosis came up at one of the presenters at presentations even. And even hearing about people whose families, relatives are affected by these conditions was really not what I expected. I wasn't expecting to run into people, although I'm not surprised. I wasn't going out of my way to find people living with autoimmune conditions, but it just came up out of conversation. They were just like, oh my goodness, I'm living with one too. And so it is an emerging issue, and it is very prevalent out there, and it's something that we need to continue to talk about and bring awareness to. And that leads us to today's episode. It is about the book called The Autoimmune Epidemic. I shared a photo of it on my Facebook group, I believe, about 2 weeks ago. It's a library book, and the library is very kind to kind of let me renew this book somewhat continuously until I finish working with it. And today I wanted to get into this book and share some of the main topics that I found that I wanted to point out about the autoimmune epidemic, as this author describes it. It is written by Donna Jackson Nakazawa, and it's about 10 years old, at least this publication, this issue, this release, this edition is from 2008. But, as you get older, 10 years goes by so quickly, and there's still so much in here that is applicable today and worth considering, worth thinking about, worth pondering. So today I'm going to be talking about this book, The Autoimmune Epidemic. In one part here, she addresses the theme of when you have an autoimmune condition for the first time and you're experiencing those strange symptoms, often people just don't take you seriously. I know I didn't even take myself seriously at first when I started to experience strange headaches and strange pains, numbness in my body. I just thought maybe it would come and go. But then just the newness of it and the unusual feeling of it did start to give me some sense of alarm. And I'm really glad I followed through with going to a specialist, looks maybe more like three specialists to get diagnosed. She mentions that at the very beginning of her book, around page 14, around the intro in this chapter called The Red Flag Disease, she talks about how her symptoms were not taken seriously. She wanted to go to the emergency room for strange muscle strain in her chest and some other strange issues. I guess this is not the author, this is somebody that she's telling the story about. And she shares about how she was getting ready to go on a trip, but then she says, well, I don't really want to go to the doctor because we already paid to go on a trip. But she decided instead to go ahead and go to the doctor because she wasn't feeling better. Interesting and common theme where either we're not able to fully take it seriously at the beginning or other people are not able to take it seriously. I know in my case that I had to really explain and describe the seriousness and the fear and uncertainty of what I was going through before my family members began to understand that, hey, this is something that we need to take more seriously, that we should not, brush off. So that's an interesting theme that came up at the very beginning of the book. Another part that is still continues to be important is the fact that there's not a whole lot of media attention when it comes to autoimmunity. We're seeing a few things out there, like the actress out there with multiple sclerosis, and a few athletes out there who have been diagnosed with Sjogren's and Graves' disease and other things. But as a overall conversation, we're still not talking about the fact that autoimmunity is so prevalent out there in the population, in the news. We're not hearing a whole lot of information about this yet. And in terms of like NIH, National Institutes of Health funding for research, we're still seeing that cancer is the number one or more common disease researched or receiving funding for research. And let's see here, trying to find this section here. Oh, so she says, consider, and I'm going to read this maybe 2, 3 sentences. Most of us at some juncture in our lives have played out in our minds how devastating it would be to have our doctor hand down a cancer diagnosis or to warn us that we are at risk for a heart attack or stroke, she says. Magazine articles, television dramas, and news headlines all bring such images home. But consider an equally devastating health crisis scenario, one that you rarely hear spoken about openly, one that receives almost no media attention. And she's referring to the spectrum of life altering, she says, life altering and often debilitating autoimmune diseases. And this book, again, was published in '08. And similarly, we're still seeing that there's not a whole lot of discussion yet about autoimmune disease in the public. So that's another theme that continues to still be timely, I would say. Another issue that she mentioned at the very beginning was the fact that people do tend to be diagnosed with more than one autoimmune disease. Uh, this case here, patients with APS, it's called Hughes syndrome, also sticky blood syndrome, APS. So she mentioned here in this chapter, patients with APS have a dramatically increased risk of migraine, sudden stroke, multiple sclerosis, and lupus. And there's just this tendency, like all autoimmune patients, Jan, this character, is statistically 3 times more likely than others to be struck with more autoimmune diseases down the road. Okay, so we're seeing that still, that autoimmune diseases tend to happen more than once in many people. Another section of the book talks about the kind of Urocenteredness of autoimmunity and the conversation. And I think it's slowly starting to change, but for the most part, I saw the same thing when I was first experiencing my condition. People were talking about how, like, people of color were not expected to have autoimmune conditions, that these particular diseases were more prevalent in Europe, for example. Although with lupus, we are seeing that it is disproportionately affecting African American women. In the case here, we're talking about multiple sclerosis. And over the past 50 years, she says multiple sclerosis rates have tripled in Finland, corroborating data in Scotland, England, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. And so there's this conference called ECTRIMS, the European Conference of Multiple Sclerosis. And I suspect that that's one of the bigger multiple sclerosis conferences around the world, just because this conversation has been part of the population and it's been researched very well and very much addressed in Europe. Multiple sclerosis rates in Norway have risen 30% since 1963. So we're seeing that there is a lot of research that is connected to Europeans. It's considered a Western disease. They're talking about multiple sclerosis being this primarily European condition, and it's something that I think needs to be further investigated. Another section here is about environmental factors. And I thought this was a really interesting part of the book where she's talking about the fact that environmental toxins in the air could be a cause of more autoimmune diagnoses. So we're talking about the epidemic in this book where so many people are being diagnosed, that we're finding so many people with this condition. And some people don't believe that it's an epidemic, although it can be said to be an epidemic when we're seeing that these numbers are increasing. We're not sure why. We're seeing, okay, maybe people are just being diagnosed more quickly. We're seeing that maybe with research that it's just been easier to understand what's going on. But also in this book, she's talking about the fact that there are certain toxins in the air that have been, when we look at geography, we're seeing that there is a connection between where people are living and the types of diagnoses that are happening. This leads me to an interesting story about somebody who has multiple sclerosis. And they talked about the fact that down the street, was it like on the other side of their block, somebody who faced a house behind her, faced her house, also was diagnosed around a similar time, which was unusual because of the fact that not too many people in one block would have something like multiple sclerosis. But hearing this story was just very interesting, and maybe we could look at some kind of environmental factor that's related. So in this book, the author talks about increase of the use of plastics, BPA, leaching out chemicals, and phthalates, and believing that this may be related to autoimmune diagnoses. And she refers to the University of Tokyo study where they demonstrated that in mice, endocrine disrupting chemicals such as BPA promoted a significantly, according to the book, increased production of autoantibodies. These are antibodies that set out to destroy one's own tissue. So she's talking about these environmental factors. And again, on page 80, the same thing. This is really interesting, though, because when we look at something like lupus, we are seeing these trends with the African American population as well. We are also noticing that 1.5 million Americans, thereabouts, are being affected by lupus. In this section here, she's talking about an African American woman who decides to start a business in a location in Buffalo, New York. And she got to know the residents of the neighborhood in Buffalo. And she was hearing stories that made her very uncomfortable because of the fact that within a block, they were seeing these diagnoses of lupus. It seemed like no more than an isolated tragic tale about a local teenager who went to her shop often, who lived a block away, who was diagnosed with lupus and passed away at the age of 18. No new drugs had been developed for lupus in more than 40 years. And then this individual's 13-year-old next door neighbor also began to be diagnosed with lupus in the same neighborhood. So it seemed very strange and was a coincidence that these two teenage girls living next door to each other would be struck with lupus around the same time. So I think there is very much of an environmental factor that we need to address out there, just like this story about the individual with multiple sclerosis who found that with her diagnosis that somebody in a house in her neighborhood was also diagnosed around the similar time. There is definitely something in environment that we need to continue to reach out and understand. And then finally, another theme that I wanted to talk about was the fact that there may be no need for genetic predisposition at this point because pretty much anyone is at risk of autoimmunity. So, because of the fact that there are so many chemicals and pesticides, metals in the soil and in the water, viruses, that are out there, that people are at risk of autoimmunity. And so that is a belief and that is a statement that is in this book. And it does seem to make sense. And I'm curious to hear about your perspective of what is going on. And do you believe that there is an environmental factor involved? Because I really believe that there is as well, because of the fact that we are seeing so many more people having these conditions. I think that it's a combination of factors. It's diet, but then again, if we're looking at neurotoxins in our food, does it really matter if we're eating very healthy or not? And then also the fact that stress is a trigger in many cases of relapse. We're looking at genetic predisposition, and there could be many more reasons why people are being diagnosed with autoimmune conditions, which makes this work so much more important and so relevant at this time because of the fact that we do need to look at this as more than one singular reason. I know there's a lot of research out there that's talking a whole lot about microbiome studies, but maybe microbiome is not the only explanation to what's going on. With the Sisterhood of Limitless Living, we are focused on things like answers. We are focused on things like from within, the knowledge and intuition from within. What is it that we see that is out of line, that is actually in conflict with our well being? What does not feel like it is working well? What is not right in every aspect of our lives? And how can we work on these things and address them to make them more favorable for our well being? And so this book brings up some really interesting points about the importance of bringing serious thought to autoimmunity, understanding that environment may play a major role in what's going on, regardless of genetic predisposition. And also that when we do control and take time to think about what is causing our condition, we may be able to take better control. So, for example, in this book, she mentions an individual who is able to manage their fatigue and manage their symptoms through things such as diet, taking time to rest and sleep, and then do things that reduce stress, and also community support. So these are some really beneficial things that can help us with the autoimmune journey. No one of these things may be the cure. No one of these things may completely bring permanent remission, but we know that working with these aspects of wellness can bring some sense of relief and benefit into our lives. So, again, social support, nutrition, considering environmental factors, and also getting sufficient rest as needed are really important as we address these autoimmune conditions. And so that is my summary of this book, The Autoimmune Epidemic by Donna Jackson Nakazawa. I'd love to hear if you've read it before, and I'd love to hear your insights and response to the book. Yeah, and really what's important is that we begin to identify patterns within our bodies and within our lives to see what is it that we need to continue to improve so that we can continue to work toward remission, continue to reduce the severity of this condition, of these diseases, and also ideally manage what is happening in our lives so that we can continue to live, rewarding lives.
Thank you for listening to the Sisterhood of Limitless Living podcast. If you like what you heard, come and follow us and subscribe on iTunes or give us a review. Also, you can join us on the Facebook group, The Sisterhood of Limitless Living, or come visit me on my website, aprilmorenophd.com. Take care.